Good Yontif. I don't have a sermon title. There's not going to be an opening metaphor. We're just going to jump right into it right now. Outside of my personal family and this temple family, Israel is absolutely everything to me. I'm a staunch Zionist. I believe that Zionism is absolutely foundational to who we are as Jews because it represents our unbreakable bond and desire to be free in our indigenous homeland in Israel. It's in this land where her citizens continue to ensure to all of world Jewry that after 2,500 years of exile, the pogroms, the Judengasse, the ghettos, the death camps and extermination camps in Europe, we will always be able to defend ourselves in order to have self-determination for us and for our children. All the Homer, and all the more so for our future generation of Jews. This morning's sermon should really have been about an urgent wake-up call about Israel's external and terrifying enemies who actively seek to murder every Jew, whether it be Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the Palestinian Authority, Hezbollah, Syria, and of course Iran, which is almost on the verge of obtaining a nuclear weapon. It should have been a sermon to ensure that our elected officials are committed to the U.S.-Israel collaboration, but it's not. This sermon should have been a call to action to ensure that we continue to send our teens and young adults to Israel annually. The facts are simple. Trips to Israel will substantially strengthen Jewish identity, but it's not about that. It should be a call to action to ensure that every single Jewish student in college can proudly display and advocate their love of Judaism, their love of God, Zionism, and Israel, free from the intimidation and violence from students and from faculty, but it's not. But rather, this sermon is about a more pressing matter in Israel that is dominating the news that demands our discussion. Thousands of Israelis and diasporic Jews are fighting about Israel's judicial overhaul being proposed by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his ruling coalition. This has caused mass protests on both sides on the issue throughout Israel and throughout the rest of the world. Concerned, many members of this congregation have sent me emails and articles written by well-known Jewish thought leaders about the dangers of judicial reforms. And here's just a sample of what they're saying. State power is shifting from judges to extreme clerics. The voice of fundamentalist religion will be emboldened. A year ago, Israel was a regional powerhouse. Within a year, we could be on the road to becoming another failed Middle Eastern state. At this fraught moment, Jewish organizations conducting business as usual are placing themselves on the wrong side of history. Save our startup nation. If we lose, then all of Israel will be like Jerusalem. It's the end of democracy in Israel. A large percentage of Israeli startups are threatening to leave Israel if the reforms pass. And even with the existential threats that Israel faces, there are many reservists in the army who refuse their orders if the reforms pass. The economy is a big concern. If they pass, they fear that the Tel Aviv stock exchange will plummet. I know we all don't share my staunch Zionism and my unconditional support for Israel. I wish this wasn't the case. I wish every Jew, regardless of observance, regardless if we are Ashkenazic or Sephardic, regardless if we're from Birmingham or from Michigan, could come together to be passionate supporters of Israel because we were all at that Sinai moment together, united, as we all accepted the responsibilities of the covenant and what that covenant meant to be there for each other. And I want to be as transparent as powerful. I don't agree entirely with these arguments quoted. And I also want to be clear. As a diasporic Jew, a Jew living outside of Israel, I strongly respect Israel's independence as its own sovereign nation that has its own unique democracy. But I do believe that honest and nuanced dialogue can stop the fighting between Jew versus Jew. After everything we have been through as a people, judicial reforms will not be the hill we die on. There's just too much at stake for the Jewish people. Because above all, we will never give up this dream that became a reality. And there's never a time, regardless of the issue, regardless of the matter, regardless who is prime minister, regardless who the coalition is in power, and keep in mind the previous coalition had an Islamist party. But we still didn't push Israel away, and we're not going to push Israel away because Judaism, the Jewish people, and the state of Israel, they are spiritually connected to one another. I'm going to keep this as simple as possible. This is not law school, and there's no exam. Israel does not have a constitution. Rather, Israel does have basic laws. Now, that's a capital B and a capital L, which since 1995, the Supreme Court has used to adjudicate the legality of new legislation passed by Israel's parliament, the Knesset. This has been a contentious issue for nearly 30 years. When Supreme Court Judge Aharon Barak, he expanded the scope and powers of the court. But now reforms are actually moving forward, which is causing the temperatures to rise to dangerous levels, fueled by emotion and fear. And here's what the pro-reformers are advocating. They want to make it harder for the Supreme Court to overturn legislation from the Knesset. A slim majority, now that's 61 out of 120 seats for members of Knesset, to have the authority to overturn Supreme Court decisions. They want to limit the power and scope of the Attorney General. They want to allow the elected officials and coalition and power the authority to appoint the majority of judges. The current system allows the Supreme Court to block candidates. The reforms would establish a more accountable checks and balances system in Israel. And finally, their argument, the reforms would complement other democracies, preventing judicial overreach. Now, here are what the opponents of the reforms are arguing. The current system that's in place, the past 30 years, is essential for Israel's unique democracy, protecting the minority coalition. The system already enforces a checks and balances protocol, which is able to hold the executive branch accountable. If the reforms do pass, they will undermine the corpus of Israeli society, the economy, and military. They fear that this will lead to greater social and political divisions and the potential for the ultra-Orthodox parties to impose legislation that could undermine the rights of many Israeli citizens. The reforms would damage Israel's reputation in the world. And finally, if the reforms go ahead, they will establish a novel and dangerous friction of world Jewry and its relationship to Israel beyond repair. It is so easy to predict a grim future when we don't like something. And I want to repeat this again. It's so easy to predict a grim future when we don't like something, especially when it comes to politics or policy. This is what pundits, this is what politicians and agenda seekers do all the time, adding gasoline to the fire and playing on people's fears to make a name for themselves in the public square. Are the pro-reformers right? We don't know. We do know that Israelis voted for political parties who campaigned on this issue, and they are in power for a reason. Are the opponents of the reforms right? We don't know. But thousands of Israelis have used their rights as citizens to protest peacefully in the only true democracy in the Middle East. And again, this has been a contested issue in Israel for 3 decades. Nevertheless, we still can't predict what will actually happen in Israel if the reforms pass. We are not prophets. We are not seers. We are offering our opinions about the latest political drama in Israel exactly the same way we do here, because change often begets fear. But being a student of history can give us some perspective, because here is what we do know from history. One of the most controversial prime ministers ever elected was Menachem Begin in 1977. Many claimed his new Likud party would ruin the foundation of Israel. His populism, his ability to fight for the Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews would shake Israel to its core. There were riots then. There were protests then. What happened? New political parties emerged because of the changes in Israeli society during that campaign. Sound familiar? He signed the peace treaty with Egypt in 1979, winning the Nobel Peace Prize. He arguably gave the most dangerous green light orders to destroy the nuclear power plant in Iraq. He was instrumental in saving thousands of Ethiopian Jews. His record wasn't perfect during his tenure. But none of the predictions by the experts ever came to fruition that Israel would become a dictatorship. His legacy continues to have a lasting and positive impact today. But maybe we're thinking, Begin showed such a strong performance on election day decades ago. In the most recent election, Prime Minister Netanyahu's party failed to win the popular vote. We as Americans, we have been debating the popular vote for centuries. There have been 5 presidential elections in which no winner received the popular vote majority, and we are still standing. And according to American historians, the 1800 election between the 2 great heavyweights, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, was considered to be the nastiest campaign ever. If we think the attack ads are bad today, they were way worse during the early years of our republic. And just like today, each camp in 1800 believed the other's election would threaten the very existence of the United States. Again, does this sound familiar? I think it does. Election day in America can bring the worst out of us. And then there's the next day where life really goes on for most Americans. The next day, most Americans go on with their day. In Israel today, even with reforms on the verge of passing and protesters taken to the streets, life goes on in Israel. Tel Aviv is just like South Beach, never turning off, where there are countless Israelis windsurfing, playing paddleball on the beach. And even in Jerusalem, this is the greatest fear, that all of Israel will look like Jerusalem. It's true, there's more people in Jerusalem that wear kippot, and you could feel the religiosity in Jerusalem. You'll still find electronic dance music concerts in the neighborhood of Rehavia, and those hipsters drinking their craft beer in the shuk. Journalist Antonio Garcia Martinez of Tablet magazine has been doing groundbreaking reporting, covering every nuance of the debate and protest. He noted that it's just like America. We don't like the majority party elected, so we threaten to move to Canada. Israelis, ironically, of all places, they're threatening to move to Berlin. It's the same guys. But here's the most critical thing he wrote throughout his reporting. The reaction to the thing is very often worse than the thing itself. Again, the reaction to the thing is very often worse than the thing itself. So in other words, there's only so many times that we get to cry wolf. And I want all the pundits, all the rabbis, all the Jewish leaders, everyone who writes an op-ed, the politicians on both sides of the issue, if you continue to add fuel to the fire, be prepared for the wolf and its pack this time. Because here is the only reality. Israel is the only guarantee for Jewish self-determination. Because of the sharp rise of Jew hatred across Western Europe, thousands of Jews are making Aliyah to Israel. And even though we are not in Europe, I am not as confident as I once was regarding our ability as Jews to thrive in this country. Jew hatred is at its highest levels here ever, and nobody seems to care because it continues to rise. We're still being harassed on campus. We're still getting beaten up in the streets. If you beat up a Jew, maybe you'll get arrested, and if you get arrested, maybe you'll serve a couple months. But there's no justice for our people. There is a systematic agenda to limit the number of Jews from participating in American life. Organizations are limiting the number of Jews to sit on boards. Diversity, equity, and inclusion officers, they have a strange obsession with Jews. When Jews face anti-Semitism, they do nothing about it. But on the other hand, they are actively seeking to limit the number of Jews from gaining admission to top colleges in the country. We know this. And we also know that more Jews were accepted into Ivy Leagues during the quota system than they are today. We're losing our major presence in government. We have less judges and city council members. We're being erased in the Ivy Tower, and even in Hollywood, an industry we launched because we had limited employment opportunities nearly a century ago. Listen to this. 1 in 6 U.S. students found the historical reality of the death toll from the Holocaust not at all believable. There are countless school curriculums throughout this country accusing the Jews of colonialism and genocide, and that Zionism, our belief to thrive in our indigenous homeland, as racist. So why does Israel matter? Why does Israel need to exist? To flourish in every sector, to be powerful militarily, and to be a light to the nation at moment's notice? Because when it's all said and done, Israel is the only thing that is guaranteed for us to be free and to have self-determination as Jews, period. The more we publicly chastise Israel, the more we mock the Orthodox communities because we fail to understand the complexities of Israeli society, the more we threaten to withhold our dollars in support of Israel because of the reforms, we are only strengthening BDS and every single Jew hater from the halls of Congress to the mobs of college students. And above all, the more we publicly go after Israel, we are passively aiding the terrorists who only seek to destroy every Jew if we continue going on this path, going after each other. It's time to put aside the emotion. It's time to put aside the fear-mongering. It's just time to remember exactly who we are as a people. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory wrote it perfectly. Despair is not a Jewish emotion, but there is a Jewish way of telling the story of our situation. What happens is not chance, but a chapter in the complex script of the covenant which leads, mysteriously but assuredly, to our redemption. Crisis in Jewish history has always led to renewal, not to spare. So it must be now. 50 years ago, Israel faced a major crisis. Prime Minister Golda Meir defeated 12 belligerent countries from wiping out Israel. From October 6 to October 25th, 1973, world Jewry was united to ensure Israel's survival as a people and Israel's survival as a Jewish state. If we were able to defeat 12 countries 50 years ago, we can get past something as simple as letting the judicial reforms work itself out. I want to repeat that again. If we are able to defeat 12 countries 50 years ago, we can get past this by letting it work itself out. This is how a crisis in Jewish history leads to renewal. My final note. It's natural for Jews to argue. Jews have argued with each other since the beginning of time in recorded history. I want us to remember since Israel's founding as a state, there have been countless and countless feuds in Israel. There have been many protests, riots. You even can find on YouTube fistfights in parliament. We argue with each other. But on the other hand, it's a shanda when we tear ourselves apart. It's an absolute shanda when we spread fear, baseless hatred, and threaten to withhold funding to a country that still needs us as much as we need them. It's time to stop crying wolf about the apocalyptic end in Israel if we don't get our way. I promise you this. Another crisis will emerge in Israel. And I also promise you that we will fight about it. But it's not the end of our story. This will just be another chapter in our complex history. But once that chapter comes to an end, the next chapter speaks to our renewal. Good Yom Tif.